Good morning, George Hepworth here, Grover Park Consulting. Let's build Mike's mobile library. Today we're going to take a look at the problem of an ID field that doesn't appear as an ID field. Actually, it's the reverse. When we give the primary key field in a SharePoint list a unique name like PublicationGenreID, sometimes it still shows up in a PowerApps application as ID, which is the underlying name. Let's see if we can figure out why. In order to try to explain how I understand this works, I'm going to create a new table in my development site. This is my existing Mike's Library development site on SharePoint. We're going to create a new table here, walk through the process of creating the table, adding names, and then renaming the primary key field or the ID field. And in the process, hopefully we can understand why we see this issue in our PowerApps with the discrepancy between the name we have given it and the name that's actually exposed in our code. Let's create a new table or a new SharePoint list. And I will call it table test. I'm not going to show it in site navigation. I don't need to create a description. We'll just create the table. Then it will generate the table or the list with one default column and the option to add additional columns. Before we do that, let's go back and look at the definition of this table with the other lists, and it's down here. We can examine the table by clicking on the expander buttons, selecting settings, and now we're looking at the settings for this particular list. Notice that it does not expose the primary key field or the ID field. How do I know it's there? I can go to the All Items view. There's the title, which is the only field that's exposed. You can see that SharePoint by default creates many other fields, which we very seldom actually use in our work with either Access front end or in PowerApps. But there it is. SharePoint has generated by default a field called ID, which is the equivalent of the auto number in the Access world. Automatically generated, sequential, required, and it's used for the primary key value. I'm going to turn off title because I don't want to use that. It's used in the SharePoint world, but it's no real use to us. Scroll down. I won't go through the rest of these settings. Click OK, and now when we come back to this view, we have the ID exposed as a column. I can add a second column, and I will select a single line of text, and we'll call it test name, and save that. Here's how I changed the name of the ID in all of the lists that I created for Mike's Mobile Library PowerApps application. It is possible to use the column setting rename property and change that to, well, test ID. And it offered me test ID because I've previously tested this, and it recalled that I used that name before. I will save that, and now it appears as test ID. If we go back again to the list here, select the expander button, expand settings. We still don't see it offered as one of the default columns we're going to work with. title is a required field, which I don't like, but I will leave that for now. We can again look at all items, which is a particular view of the list, and we can see that it now has the name test ID. The important thing to realize, and this is the reason we're going through this entire process right here, is that test ID is actually not the underlying internal name. That column name is still ID. This is an alias for that column name. As nearly as I can tell from researching this issue in various forums, mostly the PowerApps forum, but throughout the internet, what has happened is that I have created an alias by which this column is exposed in most places throughout our PowerApps application. However, there are still situations where PowerApps uses the internal name of that column, which is the original ID. I may not be 100% right. There may be other explanations, but as nearly as I can tell, this is the way it's happening. What that means in terms of our ability to use these fields is that, and I'm talking slowly while I scroll back this table. In our publications genre table, and this is true of other tables, we're just looking at this one because it prompted us. When I renamed this column, I did not change the underlying ID, underlying name, which is ID. Even though the list is known, even though this primary key value is known as publication genre ID, underneath the covers, it is still being exposed in PowerApps as ID. And for that reason, when we create this collection, PowerApps is remembering or recognizing or identifying that field as the underlying ID. I want to be clear that I could be way off base. However, having spent some time studying posts on this subject in various forums, primarily the PowerApps forum and documentation, I'm pretty sure that I'm at least in the right neighborhood as far as understanding what's going on. And for that reason, whenever PowerApps says to me, here is your ID, as opposed to saying to me, here is your publications genre ID, I no longer get all panicky because I'm looking at the wrong value or the value that I did not expect. As long as I recognize that ID is, in this context, publication genre ID, and that's the one I want, I'm good with that. I solicit and welcome any feedback that anybody might have on this topic. If you want to use the comments section on this particular video to correct me or to expand or provide more detail on this, I'd be happy to hear that, and I would love to incorporate it into my future work. But until and unless I do get that, I'm going to proceed as if that's the case. So if we take one final look at the OnStart and scroll down to the section where we're creating the collection, I'm calling for the collection of genres using the publications genre ID, and that's the one which I used as an alias for the underlying or internal ID field. PowerApps recognizes that and correctly generates my collection. No problem there. Here, as we've seen, it turns around and exposes that back to me as ID. So as long as my code recognizes that I'm going to see either ID or publications genre ID and write my code accordingly, and IntelliSense will help a lot in that, we're good to go. So with that explanation and that little bit of a sidetrack, I think we're ready to get back on track. In our next video, we'll round out our view of the elements on the publications page. You can see we have a couple of errors left to resolve. We have a couple of controls here, the icon for the home button, the icon for the sort, and the icon for the add or plus. And we'll walk through each of those elements in our next video. And then we'll move on to the next screen. If you like what you see, as always, please hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you'll be aware of future video installments when they are released. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.